Hello and welcome to the Dry Bones Army. I am so glad that you are able to join us today. Super excited about today's guest, and I can't wait to introduce y'all to Steven Neff. I was able to meet Steven recently when we both spoke at an event in Tennessee. And it was right around the time that the hurricane hit that area, and God brought both of us together in the same place at the same time for the same purpose to help the ministry of Blazing Hope Ranch. One of the things that Steven said at the event that struck me was the way he encouraged the people who were there to pray about ending human trafficking, to pray for the victims, to pray for these cases. And that just touched my heart so much. And I thought, man, we need to get this guy on the Dry Bones Army so that he can share some of his insight into some different strategies, some different things that you might not even think about, some things that need prayer covering when you're talking about human trafficking. Steve Neff is the AUSA in the Chattanooga office of the Eastern District of Tennessee for over 24 years. You think he's seen some things in this job position as the prosecuting attorney out there? This man is going to share a wealth of information. He's going to give you some insight about some strategy, how you can pray for an end to human trafficking, and he has some stories. Introduce you to my new friend and brother in the Lord, Steven Neff.
Probably preface this because the Department of Justice only lets me do these things if I make a prefacing comment of the things I say are my own opinion and not representative of DOJ, even though I know you invited me on here because I'm a federal prosecutor. So now with that out of the way, let me say we did definitely use the opportunity. We actually planted a church there with 3 other families. We did missions work with folks that have been displaced during the war with Russia from the separatist regions of Georgia that Russia kind of took over. And so they were living all together in this IDP, Internationally Displaced Persons Village in Gori, which is the birthplace of Stalin. We did mission trips out there and worked with the folks that lived in that community. It was about an hour away from Tbilisi. So my son and I actually took him out, taught him how to throw a football, and talked to him about Jesus at the same time. So it was pretty cool.
The reason I asked you to be on my podcast and meet the Dry Bones Army, we have assembled a team of intercessors, and these are folks who are committed to praying for an end of human trafficking. And every month I have a guest on who can give some insight or just some real stories so that it can start clicking and making sense for people. And I know you have a lot of those stories because of your work as a prosecutor. But when I saw your character and I heard your heart and the way you love the Lord, I was like, man, can he ever give some insight? Not just sharing some of the maybe tragic stories, the tragic truths of what you've witnessed and what you've seen as part of the day-to-day job that you have, but the insight that you could maybe help people to craft a strategy for prayer, or just encourage the team, this in the army of intercessors, and they'll be able to pray for you effectively as well, and they can add you to their list of prayers. And so I want you to be effective in the work that you do and in your personal life with your most high calling. The highest thing you could be called to do is to be a husband and a father. And
100%.
And really, if you're going to fight human trafficking, it starts in your own home. And I've seen the way that the evidence of how you've run your household reflected in your beautiful wife and your daughter. And I heard your heart at the dinner when you shared, and I would love to just pick your brain a little bit about what could the Dry Bones Army learn from you? Maybe it's on the DOJ detail that you did. Maybe it was at Fort Carson when you were a JAG. Maybe it's in the position you're in now as the prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of Tennessee. Maybe it's your Sunday morning experiences and how your pastors influenced you. I just would love to hear your heart and any stories that you want to bring up or share about.
First of all, let me say this. I'm very humbled that you asked me to do this. I sat there like most people did, listening to you and to your story. and I was floored by it. Even though I've talked to a number of people who have been trafficked in their past, and obviously, usually when I'm talking to them in the context of them as victims who are going to be witnesses in trials. And we could talk about some of those, as I did at the dinner, some of those challenges that we have as prosecutors and working through the criminal justice system, and how that interplays with survivors and how they heal, and all those things I think are really important. And I think it's maybe a gap that we need to fill a little bit, or figure out how to handle better. I think the Department of Justice is doing a pretty good job thinking about those things, trying to take a victim trauma based approach to prosecuting these cases, so that we're trying to be sensitive to those needs that we know survivors have as they go through the criminal justice process, which isn't often terribly friendly. And we understand that. So when I was listening to you tell your story, of course, I've heard stories similar to it, different places, different people, of course, but it never ceases to make me distraught to hear it. And then how you transition from what happened to you to what God did in your life, and how God transformed you, and how God is using you and using that in your background to make a difference for other people, is truly humbling that you would ask me to come on, because what you have done with your life, what you're doing for God.
I believe that God gave me the story and the ability to tell it for a reason, and he's not going to waste it. I know you've prosecuted some pretty horrific cases and heard some pretty hard stories.
Yeah, I have. I don't pretend to be a human trafficking prosecution expert. Obviously, as you saw from my bio, I have done and continue to do a really wide variety of things in terms of prosecuting cases. So, I've probably had anywhere between 8 and 10 maybe prosecutions in my career of what I would call human trafficking cases. I think, I really didn't know anything about it until the first time I did one, which was in the Army. And I was at Fort Eustis, and there was a sergeant in the staff sergeant in the Army there who was systemically raping and sodomizing his 8-year-old stepdaughter, and recording it and sharing it. And I think when it comes to human trafficking, a lot of people don't necessarily think about that as human trafficking. They sort of have, I think a lot of people have this notion that it's kind of exotic and sort of out there, and it doesn't happen here, and it's probably a bunch of Eastern European women that are being shipped in on some cargo ship and given to some giant criminal organization, which then prostitutes them out, I think. Or a more traditional labor trafficking situation, all of which is terrible. It's all bad, and it's all human trafficking, right? But I think the things that people don't necessarily understand about how you define human trafficking is that it involves child exploitation, commercial sex acts involving children, and commercial means paying for videos and paying for pictures and transporting them to places and prostituting them, and and that can all take place in a very small radius, geographical radius. It doesn't need to be somebody's being shipped in from California, perform sex acts or whatever. So it was a good education for me to start thinking about it that way, and I think it's something that we need to make sure that people understand from an education and awareness standpoint, that they may be looking at signs of human trafficking and not understand that that's what they're looking at. In that particular case in the Army, was very well respected staff sergeant. He was a leader of young men, and here he was every day after physical training in the morning. His wife would go to work and be gone, and after physical training he would go back to his quarters where his stepdaughter was, and he would rape her every day on top of the washer and dryer. And he did that for 2 years. And if you asked anybody that knew him and interacted with him on a daily basis, they would have never guessed. And so, just as you said, you may encounter a victim of human trafficking every day and not even really realize that she could be the one holding the door open for you or whatever. The other one that could be holding the door open for you is a human trafficker.
There's something called institutional grooming that traffickers are master manipulators, and they'll engage in institutional grooming. And the person who you would trust the most with your child is oftentimes the person you should be looking at through a more critical lens, because these traffickers use their charisma, they use their influence, they use their authority, they use their power, they use the trust that they very carefully craft in the community. And that's why it's devastating when people find out that a pastor or a teacher or somebody who worked at a daycare, somebody that they trust so much, that they could be doing something so horrific. This most often is the case. The traffickers spend a lot of sometimes time, money. They're very intentional on not just grooming the victim, but in grooming the community. Like, there was a system of people who were working together to abuse children. They all knew about it and they were helping each other to cover it up. And they were in power and influence. They were in positions of power and influence in our community. So how could that have been going on? And I wasn't the only victim. And all these bad people are still out there. Like, they never got held accountable for their crimes. That separation between, the crimes happening, and now it's easy for me now to talk about it as a crime, but it was very difficult. For many years, it was very difficult to see myself as a victim of a crime, to actually realize this was a criminal act. These people were working together in organized criminal activity. And I wasn't the only victim. So sometimes it makes it difficult in my healing today to trust anybody. When you're working with a victim in one of these cases, it's going to be hard for them to trust you. Yes. That you have their best interest at heart, that you have the community's best interest at heart. When we're praying for these victims of trafficking, like, maybe would it be helpful to pray specifically that the prosecutor and the law enforcement team that's working to prosecute those traffickers could find that position of trust in their lives? Would that be a powerful way to pray?
It's a fantastic way to pray, and I think it's one of the last things I mentioned at the dinner. There's nothing more important. I'm so grateful that there are people that are your partners and fellow prayer warriors, with you and on your behalf and on behalf of all the folks that are working to fight this in different ways. Right? It's a multi-front war, and and so people on every front of the war have their task and need prayer. And so there's nothing more beneficial than going to the creator of the universe, who loves you, who created you, who loves you more than anybody else on the face of the earth, and saying, hey, Father, I'm coming to you for Sandy. I'm coming to you for Steve. This is what they need in order to do this fight. Not just professionally, but personally. I don't pretend like, again, I don't do a steady diet of these cases. I don't prosecute a steady. Every time I do, it wounds my soul. And there are people who do these cases all the time. That's mostly what they're very passionate about it. They're experts on how to prosecute these cases, how to work with victims and survivors. But it wounds their souls too. And so it's one of the prayers I would say that I would actually ask for them, my colleagues who do this work regularly, it can be a very painful process just as a prosecutor, because we're human. We're government, yes, but we're not government robots. And so we all have, wives or husbands and sons and daughters and, friends and whatnot in our lives. And so it can hit us pretty hard. Before, I tell people all the time, before I routinely pray over Micah 6:8 and over Romans 13 in my job, because every job is a mission field. And God has it. Romans 13, God has given me as an agent of the government authority to do certain things, and they're to, the way I see it, our laws reflect the morality that He has given us. And so, I see what I do as a God thing. Now that scares a lot of people in the secular world if they hear, sort of a federal prosecutor talking about God being led by God, but I know no other way to do it. So anytime that anytime that I can get prayer from people who understand that, I'm very covetous of that. So yeah, I definitely appreciate that. And, I think some of the prayers can involve not just for prosecutors and law enforcement agents, but also for witnesses and for survivors. A prayer for discernment, a prayer for encouragement, a prayer for strength, a prayer for comfort. All of those are categories that are really important, I think, as we navigate this process. And it is a process that can be very unforgiving. The prosecution process is one where, in a lot of ways, I don't like really using this term, but I can't think of a better one. It's transactional, in the sense that we have a job to do, and we have to put bad guy in prison. And what we have to do before we can do that is to go out and find 12 strangers to go sit in a box, listen to evidence, and at the end of it, all of them agree beyond a reasonable doubt that this person did that, what we say they did. Now you go try to find 12 people randomly on the street and ask them if the sky is blue, and see if you can get them to agree beyond a reasonable doubt, and you won't be able to do it. The process is set up to be that way, and we want it to be that way, right? Because we don't want to ensnare the innocent. But that doesn't always make it easy for victims. And so, when I need information from them, and I need them to testify in trial and hold up in trial in order to accomplish the mission of making sure that guy doesn't do it to anybody else. But that's not terribly always consistent with the healing process. And so I think that's sort of the gap that we're working on it. We're trying to do things that make sure that their needs are taken care of as they go through the process. There are artificial timelines that the court imposes that we can't, you're still dealing with what happened to you 21 years later. There's a 70-day speedy trial clock. We can't hope that you're going to, she'll be fixed by the time we go to trial. What we don't want to do is set anybody back, or create further damage to them. And we do need their trust. And I hope they understand, when I talk to them, I always try to communicate with them on the most basic human level, not as a prosecutor to a witness or to a victim, but, as somebody, as a dad, as a husband. Hopefully they can see the authenticity that I have, that I want them to heal, but I also need them to do something else, need them to do something, that I'm required to do. So when they trust you, it's much easier to do. But we certainly need the partnership, as I said at the dinner, with organizations like Blazing Hope and whatnot, some of those non-governmental organizations that are there for them, so that when we meet with them and we have them go and talk about their story, every time you talk about your story, the tears come to your eyes. Every time I've spoken to you and you've started to talk about it, that has happened. And so if I'm forcing somebody to talk to me about what happened to them, that's painful, obviously, emotionally, and they need to have somebody there
Mhm.
when I'm done who's not me. And I might even look a lot like the person that, in some ways, like the person who did it to them as well. So I think you actually see a lot of, I don't know what the stats are, Sandy. I'm sure somebody does. The number of female prosecutors as opposed to male prosecutors who kind of specialize in these cases. But my anecdotally, I would say it tends to be more women than men. Um, and I don't know what the reason for that is. I have some theories, maybe, but one of them probably is women may have more success in empathizing with victims on a level and gaining their trust because they don't look usually. Not that women can't be traffickers, of course they can, and we can talk about that if you want. But
My
yeah,
first trafficker was a woman, so
yeah. So I think most people don't think of that either,
Mhm.
right? But I would say that probably the majority of the defendants that we see that do this are men, and therefore victims when they're having to deal with the system. If they're talking to a male law enforcement officer and a male prosecutor, there's naturally going to be a wall that gets placed up.
Mhm.
I don't know, as you said, I don't know if I can trust you. You look like you're supposed to be respected, but so is he. Um, and so, yeah, those are a long-winded answer to your question about praying for the creation of that trust. I think is important. The lowering of the walls,
Mm.
for the purposes of getting this done, and hopefully helping them understand that they now actually have power that they never had before, and they can help us do something about getting justice, not just for them, but also for others who have been victimized, as well as, and this is one of the questions that I want to ask God when I get, maybe I won't care anymore when I get to heaven. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be like. But one of the questions that I have for God when I get there is uh, how many people were not victimized because of what we did? There's no way to quantify that. There's no way for me to know that on earth, right? That is a significant power that the victims and survivors get to take part in. and and I try to get them to see it that way. It's like, now you hold the key. You hold the key. They may have prevented you from leaving. They may have manipulated you. They may have, what may have even physically locked you up. Um, and they had the key, and you were helpless. But now, shoes on the other foot, so to speak, in a way. Now you have the key. And what we're trying to do is just, and what they did to you was unjust, but we can prevent more from happening. And that's basically the goal of all of this. Traffickers being manipulated, master manipulators, and they're also masters at reading people. They understand, somehow inherently what your vulnerabilities are and how to exploit that. And that's very difficult to deal with. So um, the discernment, again, I think is important. People discerning, being able to have the discernment to understand what's happening and try to avoid it.
Even within the survivor community, there is a lot of talk around so-called protecting people, protecting survivors, and protecting victims by removing the law enforcement engagement piece so that they can make their own choice of their own path of healing and their own, they can decide if they want to testify or not. They can decide if they want to press charges on the trafficker, if they just want to move on with their lives. I'm not a fan of that point of view. Maybe that individual who was a victim of a crime, I think it's so important to remember that human trafficking is a crime. It's not some Hollywood term. They most often have multiple victims. So not only is it a crime, it's a crime that there were many victims, most likely. And if they're not stopped, if they're not held accountable for that, not only will they continue to commit these crimes, but it just degrades the culture of our society.
Hmm.
When people are able to get away with crimes like this. I think about when I lived in South Texas and there was just some kind of lawlessness. It just felt like kind of a lawless place. And we got a new chief of police. And one of the first things he did was he had his patrol officers go out targeting people that were parked the wrong way on the streets and give them a ticket. And if they were parked the wrong way, give them a ticket, give them a warning, or give them a ticket until they learn that you park going the same way as traffic. Because he said that if we're going to allow chaos like that to exist in our community, then there's no end to the lawlessness. If we're going to allow chaos like human trafficking to be woven into the fabric of our society, and we're not going to raise up that strong arm of the law and say, no, we don't allow criminals like this to get away with crimes like this. We are prosecuting to the fullest extent of the law. When there's this long list of people within the Eastern District of Tennessee who have been prosecuted for human trafficking and they're suffering now, just like their victims were. They're suffering because they decided to commit these crimes of human trafficking. That criminal is going to say, I'll stick to drugs. I'll stick to stealing cars. I'm not going to go into this prostitution ring that I thought I was going to make so much money from. Or I'm not going to abuse these children and film it and have child sexual abuse materials making me money. The work you're doing, it's not just commendable for that one victim. I don't want to minimize, the power that that victim has when they testify to reclaim their voice and to find their pathway to healing. There is no way that you could ever quantify how many people won't be abused, because not only is that abuser going to prison, but the others are going to see that as an example and say, oh,
I,
that stove is hot, I'm not touching it.
I sometimes say that my job is a perfect job for a conservative Presbyterian boy. I see the depravity of the human heart on a daily basis, but I see it in myself. We all have whatever our sins, sin patterns, whatever. I mean, our hearts can be very dark. All of us. As Jesus said, "Why do you call me good?" He was using that to illustrate a point. They didn't even understand what they were saying, right? That yes, he is good, but only because he's God. Anyway, when I have these interactions, I can't help but have that desire to have them trust me, and instead I want them to lean on not me but God. And so yeah, I mean, I think we try to when we're talking to survivors, that's clearly a goal from the transactional side of it, because we need them to trust us to go through the process, right? But it's also, I crave it from a human side. I want you to trust me because I don't want you to see the world the way you're
Mm.
probably seeing the world right now, where you don't trust anybody. I think it's very important for them to see that we care about them as individuals and not just as pieces of the on the chessboard. Um, Even though they are still kind of pieces on the chessboard, from the standpoint of getting the mission accomplished. But those two things aren't mutually exclusive. And so, going back to what you were saying about deterrence, it's funny. I in the courtroom every day, I hear defense lawyers say, "Oh, there's no such thing as deterrence. Deterrence doesn't work." And of course, you can't quantify deterrence, right? It's impossible to quantify. But I always respond with, no matter how fast you're going on the road, if you're driving down the street and you see a police car on the side of the road, how many times do you at least take your foot off the accelerator, if not actively brake your car, right? It's because you fear the consequences. And that police chief understood what a lot of, I think, law enforcement officers get, which is the whole broken windows concept of policing, right? If you let these small, minor things go by, then people are going to think they can do more and more major things.
I was a little white girl in a suburban neighborhood in a high society kind of community, and I was being trafficked within that community at
Right.
6, 7, 8, from 6 to 12. And I was 12, 13 years old. I was on the streets trying to survive, and I was trafficked often, frequently by a lot of different people. So I know that this is like sometimes it's a crime of opportunity. There are hundreds of thousands of children who were brought across the border who are now who knows where and who knows what's happening to them. I know that there are a lot of people who would be willing to risk a lot to commit crimes against a child. So, have you seen in the Eastern District of Tennessee any of these organized crime circuits?
I think the incidents of trafficking have certainly increased with it. There are a number of factors that have played a role. One certainly is a looser border where, it's easier for people to get in, and we aren't uh, necessarily terribly cognizant of what their purposes are here and where they go and what happens. I think that's certainly part of it. I think social media and the fact that the world has gotten much smaller and you can communicate with anybody anywhere.
Mhm.
We have to remember that, we think about borders as geographical locations that are adjacent to different countries. But, if you have an airport, you have a border, you have people coming in who can come in from outside the country and land right smack dab where you are without having to geographically, physically walk across or drive across, from Mexico to the United States or from Canada to the United States. So, there are lots of ways and means to traffic people. There are lots of and one of the things I did when I was the supervisor of the office here, we actually started a task force with HSI and FBI and TBI, that was a human trafficking child exploitation task force, and we have undercover agents who work online. I think that's been maybe the biggest catalyst for trafficking is the ability for traffickers to reach each other more easily and find each other more easily, and to find targets and identify targets. And when you have other people like you who can scout it out for you and find one another online and say, hey, if you have any young daughters, I have a young son, and we can trade, and we can, or whatever. I mean, just the ability to communicate has become so easy and has made it so difficult, I think, for us from a law enforcement standpoint to interdict. That's why having these agents doing this undercover work online is so important, and it's sometimes scary how well they can, how well a 38-year-old male agent can play a 13-year-old girl. I'm like reading it and it's like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. So they do a really nice job, I think, of finding them. And we try to interdict the ones that are the most serious, because there are so many of them. We can't get them all. We just can't. We don't have the resources to get them all. I mean, we could put everybody. We could take every law enforcement agent and every prosecutor and dedicate them to this, and we still are going to have tons that get left unaddressed, right? And that's depressing. And I don't want to depress people. I've prosecuted a lot of COVID fraud cases, right? There are billions and billions of dollars worth of COVID fraud in this country we're never going to catch. COVID related fraud where people just applied for money and they lied and they got the money, and what are you going to do? All we can do is handle the ones that we can find and that present themselves to us, and do our best with that. And hopefully, as you going back to what you were saying earlier, make people at least think twice before they go down that road and say, it's not, wait a minute. The trial I did that I talked about, the first one I talked about at the dinner, life plus 10 years. He's never getting out. Never getting out. He can't successfully accomplish that sentence, because he got a life plus 10 years. So, and he deserved that and more. You've seen the sort of the advent of harsher penalties for these crimes, which is important. There's talk in some states, I think, have even implemented, I want to say Florida has, of the death penalty for, certain of these kinds of crimes. So, but the crimes are as varied as the methods and the means are as varied as the human brain can come up with creative ways to do it, and as various as the motivations that people have, right? So, some people have economic motivations. for engaging in human trafficking. Some have power motivations for engaging in human trafficking. Some have sexual deviant purposes for engaging in it. It's different, depending on who it is and what we're talking about. But all of those things qualify as human trafficking, and they're all just as devastating, for the victims. So, we do our best to try to get as many as we can. And I do think that's really where it helps to have, from a practical standpoint, it helps to have a partnership and a respect and trust between law enforcement and the community, and particularly folks in the community who are very active in helping victims of human trafficking. And I've seen the phenomenon you talked about before, where certain organizations will attempt to dissuade victims and survivors from participating in the process because, as I said before, it's not always the most healing personally for them.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of why I wanted to mention the giving a source of power back to them. When you've been so powerless for so long, to be able to have a little bit of control in what happens next and what happens to the person who did it to you, that's pretty strong. I mean, not everybody heals the same. I know it may not, maybe that's not great for everybody, but I think for a lot of people it would be. And so, we need to, I think, as a culture and, organizationally, foster good communication and good relationships between these different agencies. And, we're always on the lookout for tips. So for people, it's important to get educated and have an awareness of what the kinds of things they should be looking for, and then communicate those things. The old saying, if you see something, say something, is really true in this context. And if you look, you can see where risk areas are. The individual we were just talking about that got life plus 10 years, he found young boys who didn't have fathers. That's what he was looking for, or they didn't have strong fathers. There was no strong male presence in their positive male presence in their lives, and he stepped into the void to provide that. For this guy in particular, he was in construction, and so he groomed these 10, 8, 10, not 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old boys with construction opportunities, working with his tools, doing those things that young boys are often very naturally curious about and want to learn how to do. And if they don't have a father there that's explaining all that to them, they're going to find somebody else to do it. And so he sort of stepped into that void, and that's how he got them. And he started working them on small projects and paying them just a little bit for the small projects, and got them hooked. And then he gradually transitioned them to sexual activity, which he recorded. And Sandy, I think he probably had, dozens of victims. We found 3. We know he had dozens because we have videos. We didn't know who. We still haven't identified some of them. They couldn't be identified through NCMEC. They weren't part of any series or anything else. And he also had video files of that he had bought and traded for, of thousands and thousands of boys worldwide doing the same things and being trafficked in the same way and exploited in the same way. So, fortunately, we had the 3 that we got, and they all participated in the process. And I think they all got something out of participating in the process that was positive at the end of the day. And we have a really good victim witness coordinator in our office. I should mention the importance of them, right? Because they're there kind of as the bridge a little bit between, we want to provide you with whatever services you need while we're having to navigate the criminal justice process and get to a successful conclusion.
And that's a really important position, and it's not easy, especially with all of the red tape involved working for the government. And they can't make promises, they can't give gifts. It's just, there's a lot of restrictions put on that, and it still remains sometimes somewhat of a transactional relationship,
True.
even
Right.
if they have the biggest heart, and even if they, and I have met some of these victim coordinators that are just, they really want to serve
Mhm.
and be that healthy, loving, kind person, but there's limits, because you have to get a good testimony, and there can't be any persuasion for
Right.
that testimony.
Right.
I think we really need to talk a little bit about the ICAC role. And with your task force, you were sharing about some of these law enforcement agents who did a really good job of pretending to be a 13-year-old kid. Former ICAC officers that I worked with, one time they put up an ad as a 13-year-old, and she had the phone that with the number for them to reply to in a remote community. She said it was thousands, and it made her physically sick. She had to turn off the phone and be like, I can't process this reality right now, that there are that many people in our community who are willing to pay to hurt a child. And then she had to turn the phone back on and field these calls and
Right.
texts, and hear the ideas that these criminals have to hurt these children. Um, it is a huge problem. We will never be able to root evil out of the world. There are so many people with evil intentions. The best, the best task force with the biggest superheroes that have said yes to justice and enforcing the law of the land, these superheroes like yourself and the task force members that you assembled, we're not going to solve the problem. There are too many people motivated by evil walking in darkness in this world. That's why it's so important that we do pray. I did feel for a minute a little bit hopeless. I'm going to just admit I did feel, but then I remembered the Lord told me to raise up an army.
Yeah.
And there is an army who can change the world. This army of prayer warriors, these people who have heard God prick their hearts and say, I want you to pray for an end to human trafficking. They're going to take some of the stories that you shared, as difficult as they were to listen to, and as difficult as that reality is to come to terms with. We don't have to be hopeless that there are so many bad people out there that are doing so many bad things that we're just going to have to suffer through it. We have hope that we can make a difference, that we can speak life, that we can release that hope on the wings of our prayers, that we can look to the word of God and find encouragement and
Yes.
find strength. We can come together as a community, like a global movement, to pray for an end of human trafficking. We do have a position of power. We do have a position of authority. We do have a lot of hope. What would you say to the believers to keep them filled with hope so that they won't grow weary in doing good, that they'll continue to pray, that they'll stay encouraged, and that we will see prosecution?
So just from a practical standpoint, just in terms of us and what we do, I could go down a whole list of prosecutions that we've done that have resulted in successful long prison sentences that have incapacitated people. And we're just one office. We're one small office. There are 93 federal districts. There are lots of state DA and local DAs, that all do this work. And that despite the daunting task that it is, they all come in every day and keep doing it. They keep doing it. They don't say, oh, well, it's not going to make a difference, it's not going to matter, right? Well, I mean, it's just going to go on even if I do my job, right? So it's the same thing, except from a spiritual perspective, except kind of like what I said before, you're going to the creator of the universe who has the power to transform everything, and also sits on his throne no matter what, and has a plan and understands the pain that people are going through. And this is one of the hardest apologetic things to deal with, I think, as Christians. When we get the inevitable question, why would God allow a 6-year-old girl to have to go through those things? But you know what? We're seeing it now.
Mhm.
We're seeing it now. We live in a sinful, fallen world because of the choices that we made as human beings. And so, God has the power to take that thing that could have destroyed you, and he has lifted you up to make a difference in the lives of so many people. I often it's maybe not the perfect analogy, but I think it helps people understand it. As parents, when we took our kids to the doctor to get their shots, to get immunized on various shots, they're little children, and you hand them over to the doctor, and the doctor, pokes them with this needle that hurts, and it's not even the pain that the needle causes, the physical pain. It's the anguish of feeling like they've been betrayed by the very person with the power to have stopped it. You could have stopped it and not let this happen,
Mm.
right? But you didn't, and I don't understand why. Because I'm a child. You know what? We're all children. We're all God's children, and we endure pain of various kinds and suffering of various kinds without always understanding or knowing exactly why. But God has the eternal perspective, and He's a good God and a loving God. And so we know that he works all things to his glory and our good. So being on our knees and praying about it, there's nothing more powerful in the world than that. Prayer transforms things. God uses our prayers. It changes us when we pray. God is unchangeable, but it changes us, and it causes us to do the things that he wants us to do that help stop things like this. Are we ever going to get it all? No, just like we can't, I'm never going to prosecute myself out of a job. People are people no matter where they go. People are always going to make bad choices and do evil things. We shouldn't take that as, um, we shouldn't take it as a roadblock or an obstacle to continuing to do what we think God wants us to do and seeking out his will. You sought his will for your life. He entered your life in a huge way. And then you said, okay, God, what am I supposed to do with all this pain that I have? Look what you've done. I mean,
Mm.
it's extraordinary. And all the people that have joined with you and partnered with you to do this are on that same road with you, in the car with you, traveling together, doing it for God's glory and our good. So keep it up, because there's nothing more powerful that you can do. And God may in the process reveal to you some way that you can be hands and feet, as I like to say. We pray on our knees, but then sometimes God uses us in different ways. Some people he says, you need to open up your checkbook. Some people he says, you need to get on your feet, get out there. Some people he says, you need to use your hands to do this or your brain to do that. So we all have a role to play, and our roles may change over time, but I do want people to be encouraged, because it's absolutely necessary in order to fight evil. The devil is, on the move. He's everywhere, trying to using his resources. And so God, it's a spiritual battle. I mean, it's right there in Ephesians, right? He's
Mhm.
equipped us. He's armed us. We're supposed to get out there and fight. So do it.
Ephesians, the armor of God. Right before we got on this call, I have some oil that I keep on my desk, and it's called armor. And I put my armor on before we got on this call. I am
Excellent.
so encouraged now. I am grateful for not only your service, but your friendship, your brotherhood. I'm so grateful you made the time to be on the Dry Bones Army podcast today, that you were able to share so many good strategic tips with our audience, with the intercessors that are part of this team. Check in the description notes. I'm going to link some of the scriptures that you shared, and a link to Blazing Hope Ranch, because neither one of us are on their team officially, right? But we both think that they're doing great work. I talked to a lot of the ladies that have gone through their program, and I was overwhelmed
Yeah.
hearing their stories of how they said over and over and over again how their lives have been transformed because of this
Mhm.
ministry. So I do want to encourage people, if they hear that call of God to open their checkbooks and they're looking for a place to sow into, I think that that would be a good place to direct some funds because they're doing great work. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. You know, I just loved meeting you so much at the dinner, and you know, I'm glad that my wife and my daughter were there, so you can meet them too. My daughter is actually going out to Blazing Hope on Sunday. They're her favorite horse. They're trading out for another one, so she's going to go say goodbye to her favorite horse. But she does volunteer there some with the ladies that are there, and she and Joe are friends. And so it is a great ministry making a big difference, and hopefully we can get a lot more and like that, and continue having these sort of government non-government partnerships to help people.
You mentioned about the way that God used my story, even the bad things that happened to me as a child, as a young girl, as a young woman, and he's using those things now. I wrote 3 books to tell a little bit about that story. The sale of those books supports this podcast. So if you go to authorsandystorm.com or footprintpub.com, you can get copies of those books. Sign up for the newsletter. If you want to be a part of the Dry Bones Army and you aren't signed up yet, go to thedrybonesarmy.com. I'll put links down below in the description for that as well. You can get signed up. It's absolutely free to be a member of the Dry Bones Army. You're going to get some bullets right away to put in your prophetic prayer gun. And then you're also going to get newsletter invitations when a new episode of the podcast comes out so that you can meet incredible warriors like Steven Neff. Again, thank you, Steven, for being a guest on the Dry Bones Army. Thank you for equipping our army with the tools that they need so that they can go up against this enemy of human trafficking and pray for God's will to be done on this earth as it is in heaven. I want you to be encouraged, Dry Bones Army, that wherever you are, whatever it is that God has put your hands to, you can use that to bring hope, to release the kingdom, and to encourage others to see God's goodness, even in the midst of darkness and despair. I want to encourage you, if you like stories like that about seeing the light in the darkness, go to authorsandystorm.com and get your copies of the Navi series so you can read my true story of survival and the way that God showed up even in the midst of my pain and darkness to bring me to where he has brought me today, leading the Dry Bones Army, sharing my story as a tool so you can know the truth about trafficking. You can protect the kids that you love, and you can pray for an end to human trafficking. So until then, go to thedrybonesarmy.com, sign up for our list if you're not already on there. I'll see you next month, the second Tuesday of the month, for our next episode of the Dry Bones Army podcast. And until then, God bless you and have an amazing day.